All right. We're now recording the British Columbia government stance on the Coastal GasLink pipeline. Sorry. Our team members are Tom Shitu Adebayo, Sekshi Bagadan, sorry, Mia Giulino, I apologize for that, Michael Webster, Ariana Adams Bridger, and Genyun Kiao. There we go. So it is our stance that the BC government is in favor of this pipeline based on the vast economic benefits that it will have both for the federal government and for the provincial government. These benefits will come through the increased tax revenue from the company, as well as possible tariffs on the exported oil and gas. As well, there will be many jobs created, and skilled workers will be trained that may have skills that can be applicable in other fields. The pipeline is also necessary due to certain market changes in the market for liquefied natural gas. In the course of the development for the pipeline, an environmental assessment was completed and a certificate was granted, although it did have several conditions on the behavior of the company. So despite the economic benefits, there are some very relevant issues with the pipeline. Namely is the environmental impact to the land, air, and the water that will come from the construction of the pipeline, which will need which will necessitate the construction of various roads and bridges, as well as possible spills from the pipeline. As well, in our presentation, we tried to include the perspectives of the indigenous peoples living in the area, and we'd like to show that consultation has been undertaken with the indigenous people. And despite the public protests, there is a division in the viewpoints in the various indigenous communities.
The positive implications of the British Columbia pipeline. The pipeline construction is expected to create 5,000 new jobs that will be able to financially support families. After the pipeline is stable and open, there will be between 45 to 75 permanent jobs open. One of the major gas lines benefits for Canada will be the $80 million in revenue that it will create. TC Energy has made a commitment to the Aboriginal businesses and communities to take full advantage of the LNG opportunities to benefit their people. And the next slide.
Yep.
Why is the BC government expanding the pipeline? By Canada having natural gas, they are able to sell it to other countries. Natural gas has been in its lowest pricing in the past 4 years due to a surplus of natural gas. The United States has historically been one of Canada's biggest consumers of Canadian natural gas. One of the major reasons why BC government is pushing for the pipeline is because the LNG Canada project will take fracked gas from the GasLink pipeline and transport it overseas to foreign markets.
Environmental Assessment Act. Environmental assessment can be defined as identifying, estimating, and evaluating the environmental impacts of existing and proposed projects. By conducting environmental studies to mitigate the relevant negative effects prior to making decisions and commitments, the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act 1992 is an Act of Parliament that was passed by the Government of Canada in 1992. The Act requires federal departments, including Environment Canada agencies and Crown corporations, to conduct environmental assessment for proposed projects where the federal government is the proponent or where the project involves federal funding, permits, or licensing. The purposes of the Act were set out as follows: to achieve sustainable development that conserves environmental quality by integrating environmental factors into planning and decision-making process, exercise leadership within Canada and internationally, and to provide access to information and to facilitating public participation. The original version of the Act was repealed in 2012 and rewritten by the Harper government. The new law came into effect on July 6, 2012. There are many facets to the planning for a pipeline and to the regulatory process that are being followed. The Coastal GasLink project is primarily regulated under the Oil and Gas Activities Act and the Environmental Assessment Act. The EAO process provides for the thorough, timely, and integrated assessment of the potential environmental, economic, social, heritage, and health effects that may occur during the life cycle of these projects. And the process provides the meaningful participation by First Nations, the public, the local governments, and federal and provincial agencies. The BCOGC reviews and assesses applications for industry activity, consults with First Nation, ensures industry complies with provincial legislation, and cooperates with partner agencies. The Canadian Environmental Assessment Act 2012 and its regulation established the legislative basis for the federal practice of environmental assessment in most regions of Canada. The Coastal GasLink pipeline received an international assessment certificate on October 24 in 2014. On May 16, 2018, the certificate was amended after two portions of the pipeline were redesigned. In total, Coastal GasLink's environment assessment certificate is subject to 32 conditions. The company needs to fulfill these legal obligations in order to continue to comply and mitigate its environmental effects. In order to ensure that the pipeline is constructed in conformity with its environmental assessment certificate, the Environmental Assessment Office has established processes.
There are several possible environmental problems with the pipeline. One of the main impacts will be the increased tanker traffic through the Burrard Inlet, which is near the proposed processing facility. This could run the risk of collisions happening in the port or in the inlet, as well as possible leaks into the water surrounding the area, which could harm the local wildlife and marine life, especially the 76 resident orcas in BC's southern coastal waters. Environmentalists have also claimed that the official review of the pipeline didn't go in depth enough into the hazards of the crude oil being spilled from the pipeline and the various negative effects that could have. Additionally, there are negative impacts to the Indigenous peoples, particularly, which live around the proposed site for the pipeline. One of the main things that they're worried about is the oil spills, but also there's the environmental impacts that the construction of the pipeline would have, which would negatively impact the hunting and fishing, which are important cultural practices for the peoples there.
This part is for analyze the status of the indigenous people's thought on the BC government policies and also the government's response. I've broken this as 4 aspects. The first part is the agreement between the BC government, engine companies, and the indigenous people. The second part is the BC government explanation of the police officer arrested the demonstrators. And the third part is the different indigenous people have different opinion in this case. I used some of the specific example to explain that. And the fourth one is the last thing that I have to reorient to BC government's attitude and concept summary of the First Nation. Next page, please. So the first one is to talking about the agreements between the BC British Columbia government and the agent company and indigenous people. From the existing information, it seems like most of the people have the objection to the expansion of the Costco GasLink pipeline due to some of the indigenous people, mainly the five chiefs and also some of their followers. They're against this agreement and they have received a certain public opinion support. So everyone would make some mistake that believe that the majority of the indigenous people are opposite to this strategy of the expansion of Costco gas plant in the BC provincial governments. But the fact is the majority of the people are support this project. The contractor company, TC Energy, has reached the agreements with the 20 Aboriginal elected committees along this way. So this part is the BC government explanation of the police officer arrested demonstrations. In this part, I have to list of what was happened first. So the first thing was the 5 leaders of the Aboriginal tribe. They asked the BC provincial government to cancel the license for this project. But in this event they have a discussion. Actually, it's a negotiation, but this negotiation was break down. Once they broke down the negotiation with the government, these leaders began to lead their followers to organize the roadblock to prevent workers for constructing the GasLink pipeline. So then the British Columbia provincial courts issued an injunction requiring the demonstrators to remove the roadblock, and authorized the Royal Canadian police officer to arrest the people who violated the injunction. So the police officer in the Aboriginal land arrested some of the demonstrators. Then the demonstrators began to resist. For example, some of them placed the metal spikes on the road to try to destroy the police officer's car. And then after that, the conflict start to escalate and rose to a national political level. So the British Columbia's government explanation of the reason why the police officer arrested people was some of them are too extreme and have some illegal behaviors. And the police officer arrested them is reasonable and legal. And the police officer did not arrest any innocent indigenous people. So, and also we have to organize this like even the negotiation was broke down. So the attackers still shouldn't have the right to destroy the police officer's car. So nor they can violate the government injunction. This is the legal level of the destruction of the public property of obstruction law enforcement. Next page, please.
Sure thing.
Yeah. So this part is to talk about the different indigenous people have a different opinion in this case. According to the CBC service interview, the people who have opposite opinion with that is not necessarily accounts for the majority of the indigenous population, but there are five indigenous leaders inside of this opponent who have like sufficient and prestige to gain the support for the other indigenous groups. So many indigenous people did not dare to express their concerns because they feared to being isolated or punished by the leaders, which also lead unequal information. Next, please. So the last thing I have to do is to rearrange the BC government's attitudes and concept summary of the First Nation. The thing I have to mention is the BC government is not trying to suppress the rights of the Aboriginals, but the strict to the giving the Aboriginals more economic benefits and help the First Nations to have better development. And we also understand the Aboriginal support of the government. Not only do the vast majority of the indigenous people support the BC government policy, but also there are many people in the only opposition group who also support the BC government. So, but those people, they are limited in their speech. And there is historical issues revealed by this instance. The elected committees of the Aboriginal resources are the products of the relevant feudal law and are usually responsible for the things related to the federal government, absolutely including the infrastructures, especially in certain regions. Therefore, the agreement signed by the tribal elected committees is valid. But now those 5 leaders of this group do not recognize this agreement. The first reason they give is that the expansion project may affect the environment in a negative way. And the second reason is the elected committees are established under the Canadian Indian law. So they believe that elected committees has no power to make this decision about their old ancestral land. But in this case, however, those leaders did not mention that there are many members of the elected committees are also heard, also from those indigenous group, and they are the hereditary leaders of this tribe too. So, and those leaders with 2 positions also have the right to choose what to choose for the indigenous tribe. So the biggest concern for those opponents is for the environmental issues. The BC provincial government guarantees that we will work with the appropriate environment protection strategy and solutions.
All right, so I'm going to be talking about briefly the negative impact and possible solutions to the negative impact. So just briefing through the Coastal Link pipeline. On October 2nd, BC and Canada approved Trans-Canada Coastal GasLink pipeline through West Wet'suwet'en land. Hereditary chiefs are regarded as the rightful decision makers of the land. The Coastal GasLink pipeline does not have the permission of the Wet'suwet'en chief and people. Before any big decisions is made on the Wet'suwet'en or any First Nations land, a relationship and a treaty must have been signed in order to proceed with any construction. Canadian government violated this treaty, while the Wet'suwet'en people also feels that this construction doesn't benefit their natural land resources. For example, clean water and land. And it's like a cycle, because in the clean water, they have fishes, they have animals which they eat, which could overall in turn affect them. The fact of the matter is that the Coastal Link pipeline is not a conventional pipeline, and on both ends of the pipeline, there are bad economics and terrible climate policy. It is a threat to the Wet'suwet'en nation's way of life and environment because pipeline spills are not predictable, which would negatively impact the Wet'suwet'en nation's land in the long run. And there's a short video that we will just briefly explain the whole scenario.
There have been protests to this energy pipeline in BC. However, I guess in the most recent, I want to say report by the Montreal Economic Institute, you have suggested that band councils are in favor of this project?
In fact, all the band councils of the First Nations that are affected directly by this project have signed on the project, and they consulted widely the members of their nations. So there's an agreement that has been signed. There is a duty to consult, and this was done. But however, there's no duty to get unanimity on a project, and there's also no veto right to any smaller group. And in the First Nations, as in the population at large, it's impossible to get unanimity in favor of any project. So here we're in a situation in which, in fact, probably a small percentage of the people who are not satisfied with this project are blocking it. And I think that's a major problem.
Are these protests, I mean, I'm just wondering about the makeup of them. Is this something, it's not something new, but how has this kind of emerged? Where did this emerge from in the last month or 2 months?
Well, there's an elected council for each band, and they approve in each territory. They approved the project. They negotiated. They got compensation, and they consulted. But in the First Nations, there's often elder, let's say, statesmen who are not elected, who are traditionally have a voice, and some of them, a minority as I understand, are not in favor of the project. So in fact, they simply decided, well, we're going to block this project. And I think that they are probably encouraged by activists in the East.
I'm wondering.
All right, so
Oh, sorry.
yeah.
There you go.
So I'm gonna continue. It is quite interesting that some other First Nations are in support of this pipeline, while the people directly affected have tried to stop this construction. The Western Nation have voiced out their stand on the pipeline, but the Canadian government continue with their project anyways, which has led to the protests and blockades and retaliation. It is quite difficult to think of possible solutions in a situation where there are both supporters and oppositions. And some of the possible solutions me and my group members have thought about are one, keeping the protests and blockades going. So like if the railways are blocked or territories are blocked and barricaded, resources won't be able to flow through Canada as much as it once did. It's going to obstruct the flow of the norm, and it's going to hinder. Yes, it's going to help prevent the coastal pipeline from like proceeding. Another solution is economic reconciliation. That is, most of this, not most of them, but I'll assume some of them are maybe like not as economically well off as others. So if they're living high standard of life, if they had high standard of living, it's going to make things easier because they won't really focus too much on that because they know they have other options. And the third one is negotiations between the provincial government and the Western Nation. That is compensation. So, for example, like if a treaty or a deal can be made with the provincial government and the Western Nation, they can come together. They can they can compensate the Western people for this. If there's any, for example, if there's any complications, they can compensate them with money or jobs. That's basically leading to my last solution: more job opportunities. So if more money is pumped into this Western Nation and they have no they have something to fall back on, I feel that yes, these are some of the possible solutions. In conclusion, while the majority of the First Nations are in support of this, some others fear that their land is at stake and their way of living is threatened. In fact, a major concern with the pipeline is its effect on the land and possible outcomes resulting from spills. The Western Nation, if the Western Nation are assured by the provincial and federal government on compensation and more economic opportunities, That is, if the government can provide alternative source of income, if there's any complications, I think the Western nation will be more open to the pipeline as long as the standard of living improves in that territory. Additionally, it is the case of the economic benefits of the pipeline to outweigh the possible harms to the environment. To limit this negative environmental effects, the BC has attached conditions to the environmental assets assessment certificates needed by the corporations to engage in the construction of the pipelines. These conditions will not entirely prevent environmental damages, but will limit it to the point where it's acceptable.
All right, and here are our works cited. And that's the end of our presentation. Thank you for listening.